recognition in this part of the plan that the recommendations that come from OPAC to the Commission have to be evaluated based upon that set of criteria. And after making the findings, LCDC will adopt the Territorial Sea Plan and the proposed amendments through its ordinary rulemaking process. If the LCDC cannot make the required findings, and again those findings are based upon carrying out the policies of the Ocean Management Act, being consistent with statewide planning goals, and or compatible with county plans, it cannot itself amend the Territorial Sea Plan. So the Commission must send the plan back to OPAC for additional work. And while this is old language from Part 1, we do recognize that there's additional updates to this language through statute, right? So, and what is sent back to OPAC is called specified revisions, right? So we'll get into that a lot tomorrow when we discuss Part 5. The next part of this section describes how the council envisions changes to the plan occurring. So there were two specific ways by which consideration the council may choose to initiate an amendment process. The first of which is through an issues survey. So this an issues survey is really a summary of what has happened within the state, kind of what's the state of policy, what are the driving forces kind of in the development of ocean policy. And actually this is a part of the Territorial Sea Plan that, in my experience, I have not actually seen be implemented. So, and that's something that I think the council should consider reinstating or putting priorities on, because I think it would be very valuable to have on an annual or biannual basis a summary about the activities within the Territorial Sea. So how many leases came in, how many plan amendment proposals were received, what is the status of rocky shores. I think those can all be kind of encapsulated in an issues survey that's delivered to the council that summarizes the ongoing discussions and current events of the day. The second means by which an amendment could be initiated is through a request. And those of you who were here in December of 2015, when we got the request that the council consider amending Part 3 of the Territorial Sea Plan, which is the Rocky Shore Strategy, that's one of the things that the council considered when it was deciding to take on this work. So those are the two means by which there's a description of how OPAC would choose to initiate an amendment. Following that kind of receipt of either the issue survey or of a written request, the council, there's a description of how the council will consider that information. Basically, it's going to evaluate to see whether or not it deems kind of that amendment process appropriate, whether or not there's the logistical issues, staff support, resources to be able to handle the undertaking of an amendment. If it decides to move forward, then the council recommends the creation of a work program so that there's an expectation about how long an amendment may take and about what the steps of that amendment may be. There's guidance on public participation in that amendment, basically referencing public meetings laws and best practices for ensuring decision making has everyone has been given early notice and an opportunity to be heard as a part of a public meeting. And then guidance on the fact that the council will approve and submit recommendations at the end to the commission. So that's the end of kind of the changing or the plan implementation section. And the last piece in part 1 is then ocean management goals and policies. So this was, as I mentioned earlier, an amendment to part 1 that came about in 2000. So this is one of the more recent components of part 1. And it reinforces and kind of restates a lot of what we've already said, basically related to consistency of the plan with Goal 19, conservation of long-term values, benefits, and natural resources of the territorial sea for citizens in the both near and long term. And then it describes ways that from a policy perspective, the state is going to go about doing that. So it says it's going to give higher protection to renewable marine resources. It's going to support the development of ocean resources that is environmentally sound and economically beneficial. It's going to protect kind of the marine life and functions and the ecosystems that those uses depend upon. And then it recognizes the role that Oregon's ocean plays with the larger marine region. So Oregon is just one small component of the larger California current large marine ecosystem. So a recognition that we have an impact potentially on our neighboring states and countries, given that that large regional system exists. Now there are basically a short list of policies that are developed in this section of the plan. The first is kind of the definition of the scope of the authorities of council. And it provides that basically state, federal programs and activities that affect the resources and uses of the Oregon Territorial Sea shall be managed and developed and conducted where appropriate, again, to restore the long-term benefits provided by Oregon's marine resources. It requires that those actions, those activities meet the requirements of the Territorial Sea Plan, in particular, the Part 2 Inventory, Information, and Effects Analysis. And then it describes those important things that it's going to protect, all those things I've kind of already mentioned in Goal 19. I did not include the second broad policy in my presentation because it's focused on estuaries, and the council really has not had any dealings with kind of estuary management, but it does recognize the fact that the ocean impacts estuaries, and as such it says that the Territorial Sea Plan and the activities within the Territorial Sea Plan should be considered for the potential impacts to species within our estuaries. So it recognizes them as part of the marine waters, and as the system as a whole is a continuous gradient from onshore to offshore. The next policy within Part 3 is kind of an enumeration of the different management strategies or measures that may be put into place in following the principles and the policies of the plan. So it talks about requiring things like cumulative effects assessments or adaptive management or conditional approvals for different types of activities to ensure that the state, when it's reviewing proposed action, has an ability and has different techniques and tools so that those activities are carried out consistent with the provisions in the Territorial Sea Plan and with our ocean policy goals. I'm not going to go through that whole list, but it does provide guidance on kind of each of those items. It also says that it's the policy of the state of Oregon to prepare and regularly update a marine research strategy. This is maybe one of the long lost policy pieces in our Territorial Sea Plan, which we have not as a council implemented very well. And there's been a lot of discussion recently, especially by the Oregon Ocean Science Trust, about research priorities for the state. And so this policy can provide a nexus for the council to have input into what that long-term research strategy may be. And then the final policy in the goals and policies is the fact that the state, through the Territorial Sea Plan and through the Oregon Ocean Plan, established in law an ocean stewardship area. Now this area is a recognition of the fact that our state has interest in natural resources and human activities that exists not only within our territorial sea but cross into the outer continental shelf. We know that the organisms that we fish for, the cables that are laid, the activities that occur just don't stop at the 3-mile line because of the end of the state jurisdiction. And as such, the state of Oregon defined the stewardship area out to the toe of the continental shelf, within which it's trying to promote state laws and standards in the interest of management and conservation of ocean resources within that broad area. It encourages the scientific research of the systems, resources, and oceanographic conditions so that we can have a better understanding about basically the system, how it moves across the shelf from federal waters into state waters. And it seeks to establish kind of co-management arrangements where possible with federal agencies so that we can attempt to have them follow plan provisions that are within the Territorial Sea Plan. And then it finally says that we will also seek to cooperate with other states and governmental entities through regional mechanisms, recognizing that those resources that exist on our continental shelf and in the Territorial Sea Plan are regional in nature, many of them. So that concludes my presentation for part 1, and I know that that was a lot to cover in a pretty short period of time. I will take questions that I may or may not be able to answer depending upon specificity and focus area, but happy to do so where the council has interest.
Yeah, thank you for that presentation, Andy. I appreciate it. It's like being back in grad school.
Yes.
That's good. One thing we forgot to do earlier was take roll on the phone. If anyone was joining us via phone, do you happen to
We have a few people, but they're all on mute so that we don't have a bunch of background noise interacting.
Can we
Let me
mute them
check.
for 1 second?
Yeah.
If there's someone?
Looks like we have Delia Kelly, Bridget Lorman, and SD, or SDS. We have other participants. Looks like we do have Megan Clear on the line. Do you want me to unmute any or all?
Well, I guess, is there a way that they can raise their hand, like if Megan would like to ask a question, how is she going to communicate with us?
Yes, she can send a chat, which we would see on, as a little indicator up here, which is hard to see. Usually I have 2 machines that are working to control the system, but due to technology gremlins today, I only have 1, so that's harder logistically.
Okay, so for folks on the phone, if you didn't hear, if you have a question or would like to participate in the dialogue, particularly with Megan as an OPAC member, you have to send a note in the chat, and we'll keep an eye out for it. And you can also send me an email if you want at jcarter@tnc.org, and I can try to watch my email. All right, so with that, pulling back up to PowerPoint, are there questions reflect some of the changes that have occurred either in statute or other mechanisms. I'm seeing a head shake no.
My understanding of this is no, that there was a section that was added in 2000, which was the ocean goals and policies section, but that the rest of the goal, or part one text has not been amended. Steve, do you have any understanding?
I don't have any recollection of that.
Thank you. Charlie?
I think it's just a follow-up question to that. Has anybody audited the statutes that relate, the new statutes that sort of relate to the, or have bearing on the territorial sea plan? So we at least know what's out there.
In part is my answer to that. I know that the OARs that are implemented by Department of State Lands for implementation of the territorial sea plan, and in particular that they had language and rules for part 5. Those were recently amended. I'm not sure about the other statutes, and I don't think we have done an audit to do that check. Patty, do you have?
Well, I was just gonna say, I don't think we've done an official audit, but, you know, when it comes to mind, there's a number of statutes that when and if we go back to part 1, that we would add the Ocean Science Trust, the OA Council, those are all relatively new that are reflected in part 1. And when we go back to part 1, those would be, we would wanna do a more official due diligence of looking at all the other statutes. So I think we keep track of them. We monitor them, of course, every legislative session, and we're involved in a number of those entities, but we haven't gone back and officially, you know, obviously updated part 1 to cover those.
I mean, I remember too, I can't remember if it's in this section or section 2, but it still talks about MMS. And so I think there's lots of nuances that could be changed, but also bringing it up to date would be helpful. I think it's challenging for not only OPAC members, but others to go try to read the territorial sea plan and be like, oh, I'm reading the most recent thing. But actually I need to go check out, you know, 3 other statutes and have to remember all this other stuff and where it lies. So, you know, maybe something to put on our list at some point to go back and help with part 1. Are there other questions?
I know the history part 1 certainly could be amended to include, you know, events up to the current day. I think there is value in basically describing those policy processes that have taken place.
We also offered an opportunity for index cards in the audience for folks that want to ask questions. So if you have any, make sure you hand those to Lorinda and we'll incorporate it into this Q&A session.
Are there any? None. None yet.
I guess one other question I have is I actually went back, because maybe I'm a policy dork, but I went back and read the ocean plan from 1991 this week. And I guess my question is this, is that plan still relevant? Like how does it relate? And I also, when I was reading, it seemed like when you showed that hierarchy of needs, it said that the ocean plan sat on top of the territorial sea plan because it referenced more things in federal waters. It was more encompassing than the territorial sea plan. The territorial sea plan is a subset of the ocean plan. And so I just didn't really understand how relevant that relationship is today versus what it might have been in the early 90s.
That's a great question, and I'd like Steve to weigh in on this. In my view, I think about the ocean plan kind of as our earliest ocean uses atlas, as ocean resources atlas. And the value of that was that it was the kind of first major characterization of all of the natural resources and human uses to be considered when planning occurs. And in doing so, it's foundational for the territorial sea plan because there were specific places that were referenced in that plan that were identified as sensitive. So there's a number of rocky shores and reefs, I think, that are in that part of the plan, that the Territorial Sea Plan Part 3 built on. But I'd love to hear Steve's comments on this as well.
So, thinking about it, the ocean management plan would be directed at a larger area and would be more of an attempt to influence some federal policy. But the territorial sea plan, so it would be a subset of the, we need to be consistent with the ocean management plan. But as far as the territorial sea plan would have, in essence, greater enforcement capacity because it is an area which the state has jurisdiction over, whereas the ocean plan would lead it to federal bounds. So there's kind of a hierarchy, but there's also a hierarchy of enforceability.
I will also note, I was very interested to see there are actually people in the room that were part of that original ocean plan, so maybe folks have other history they want to offer, but. Charlie?
This will come up again during my presentation, but with respect to section F of part 1, where it talks about amending the plan, this certainly has bearing on what we're going to be doing with part 5, and also what we will be doing with part 3. So whatever part 5 says about amending the plan, and whatever part 3 says about amending the plan, should be consistent with what it says in part 1 about amending the plan. So we may need to adjust, or we may think about adjusting and doing some updating in part 1, specifically section F, or at least making sure that whatever we insert into 5 or 3 is consistent with that of F. So that was a mouthful, but hopefully that made sense to you folks.
Patty?
That was actually one thing I noticed is that when we go back and update part 1, that we need to make sure that that section is consistent with the statute that was amended in 2013. I don't know what's exactly.
We can't hear you.
And so, of course, the statute would trump, hate to use that expression, but would be the higher, that would be the, where we would go. So if the plan is not consistent with statute, we still need to follow the statute. So whatever amendments we did to part 3 or part 5 would be consistent with the statute. Ultimately, we go back and amend part 1 to be consistent with the statute.
So Megan has a question in the chat that I'd like to read for you. She says, for folks who don't habitually read through environmental laws, i.e. the public, how is or has the TSP been conveyed or shared? Is there a way, as you guys are talking about updating the TSP, that a more public-friendly deliverable could be developed as well, if it doesn't already exist? So I think that's a question for everyone. It is shared in the, I guess, traditional method of having the language of the Territorial Sea Plan be available in PDF form. There are maybe one or two exceptions to that, in that online map products exist, so there are geospatial information that are present that can be discovered online, and somebody could pull those into their GIS systems today, but they are related to specific sections or chapters of the Territorial Sea Plan rather than the whole. So I think it's an interesting question.
Is there a series of fact sheets or TSP 101 documents, and have any of those been created through that part 3? And Deanna's been really great at outreach materials.
I do not think there is. The closest that we get is sometimes ahead of an amendment to a plan, we will create a citizen's guide where we basically summarize the highlights and then direct people to specific language as possible. So the Citizens Guide to Part 3 of the Territorial Sea Plan is an example of something like that. It's written for a more public-friendly audience and is maybe 3 3 or 4 pages rather than, tens or 20 pages. So that's maybe one of the best examples of kind of a fact sheet, but it's an interesting question and observation. How do we make this plan more accessible and easier to follow and research? Thank you, Megan.
Any other questions? Chris, not to put you on the spot, do you want to talk at all about how this relates to anything NOAA related, or are you good?
No, I'm happy to lend my thoughts there. And I actually am skimming through the ocean plan itself right now, which is fun. I guess I'm a policy geek too. I think the main thing I've noted in going back to the very specific policy language in here, is actually saying, for the ocean plan itself, is saying, there's no enforcement authority for the policies in here. They're really meant to be the recommendations of what we see either in the territorial sea plan or in other agency policies as they get carried out. And so maybe that's NOAA related, but more just with thinking about what's going on with the Part 3 update is it seems like there's some pretty concrete language around recommended policies and management recommendations in the ocean plan, but I don't know if that group has gone back and revisited, or if they have. I think that's great, and I think that would be good to do, because I see very specific policies in here where it seems to be the intent of the state to say, this is what we'd like to see in a plan that would be enforceable. Where, well, the ocean plan isn't, we've thought this out, and made these recommendations here, and that's how it's characterizing it, at least in my current skimming. So that's just something that jumped out to me now that I thought was worth noting.
Any questions from the audience? Otherwise, we're gonna move on. Going on part 1. Okay.
Gina, how are you doing on time?
You are 7 minutes ahead of schedule, sir.
May I suggest that everyone stand up and take a break before we dive into another text-laden